Welcome to Project Quiver, a father-daughter journey across the globe to capture the artistry and spirit of the world's finest traditional bow carvers. I'm Todd, the father. Ella is my daughter. Together we're on a mission to create a stunning coffee table book that profiles more than a dozen master bowyers and their unparalleled skill. For each chapter, we travel to the bowyer's workshop, carve a bow under his guidance, photograph his woodcraft in detail, and share his story here on the Salish Wolf podcast. The book is called Quiver, The Art of Life Through Bowcraft. And this journey, our living story, is Project Quiver. Hey, Weylin, welcome to Project Quiver on Salish Wolf.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's great to meet you. Thanks for doing this, and thank you for being part of Project Quiver, which is going to culminate in a beautiful coffee table book of the world's best bowyers, which I certainly consider you to be. And I'm honored. My daughter and I both are honored to be able to come and visit you in just a couple of weeks. You're the first one we're coming to see.
Oh, really?
So
I appreciate
you
that.
are. Yeah, you'll kick off Project Quiver, and from there we're going to be on like a 4 or 5 month world tour.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah. So how did you get into archery? I guess we'll start from that before we get into bow carving.
I grew up hunting and fishing in Wisconsin with my dad. He was a bow hunter as well as a gun hunter, and I shot his fiberglass bear recurve every once in a while for fun. I certainly wouldn't say that I was into it at that age. It was just something I did every once in a while, and all the hunting I did when I was younger was with a shotgun or a rifle. We did a lot of deer hunting and bird hunting, rough grouse, things like that up in northern Wisconsin. And so it wasn't really until I became an adult that I got interested in archery. I had an opportunity to go to this primitive skills gathering up in northern Wisconsin on Lake Superior, and it was all sorts of crafts and skills being taught, basket making and hide tanning and tracking. And there was a guy that was teaching bow building, and I just kind of caught my interest and decided that's what I wanted to dedicate my time to. I didn't have time to finish the bow there. It was just I came in late. Other people were already well into the tillering process, and I was just hacking away at this big hickory stave with a hatchet and a rasp, and but it was enough to kind of get me interested. And my dad gifted me a few Pacific U staves that he'd cut back around the time when I was born in Northern California, and he just kind of kept and intended to do something with and never did. And started reading the Bowyers Bibles, and it's kind of information overload for me. I was still kind of too nervous to do anything substantial on the stave that I'd started. And we moved out to Oregon, my wife and I, so I could pursue some teacher training out there. And I knew one of the authors of the Bowyers Bible, John Strunk, was living out Tillamook. And so eventually I decided I wanted to go out and build a bow with him and get further into it. And so I spent a weekend in his shop building a bow, a U bow from start to finish with him. And he also helped me finish the hickory bow that I started. And it was really, that was definitely the catalyst for me. After I built that bow with him, I really felt like I could do it on my own, that I wasn't going to be perfect and was going to make mistakes, but he gave me a really solid foundation and really just kind of helped distill the essence of what bow making was. And helped me, he's like, just forget all that stuff in the book for now. Like it's too much info when you're starting off, just focus on this and this. And he was a retired high school shop teacher, and so I think he had a gift for teaching people how to do things. I've met other bowyers that are very accomplished bowyers, but they weren't all that great at conveying the knowledge that they had. They just kind of had to pull it out of your hands and do it for you. And he was pretty good at helping me walk away with the fundamentals, to really dig into it on my own. And from there, it was really, um, I really got into it. I was on the Primitive Archer Forum, which was an online forum supported by the Primitive Archer magazine. I met some other people in the Portland area where I was that were into bow making as well, and kind of joined a community there. And so I always feel like it's really important to say that from the very beginning, I had some really expert help, both from John Strunk and some of the other people around me, like Gordon Furlich and my friends Carson Brown and Bryce Ott were both getting into bow making, kind of in the same way that I was. And so I had a lot of people to help out with, issues and bounce ideas off of and meet up with and compare, compare bows. And, I definitely never would claim to be a self-made man in terms of my bow making. I've been very fortunate. Whole time along the way, I've been surrounded by people who have not only been generous with their time and expertise, but, have hooked me up with tools and staves and places to work. And I'm really grateful, for the community that has been around me this whole time, whether it's been remote, online or in person.
Yeah, I'm always amazed at how big this community of amateur and professional bow carvers is. I had no idea when I got into it that there were so many people, and people who are tuning in on social media, YouTube, watching videos, people buying bows from people like you. It seems to be quite a large audience. Do you have any estimation on like, how many people in the U.S. are
That's a good
interested in bow
question.
carving?
I don't know exactly or even roughly how many. It's hard to say. It feels like there's a resurgence of interest, I think largely precipitated by the internet and social media. I think that when the authors of the Bowyers Bible came together, I think they helped create another resurgence, those decades ago when they put all that together. But this is, I think, a continuation of that and also an expansion of that. Um, I don't know. I mean, like, if you look at like a popular primitive bow building group, like Primitive Bow Making on Facebook, they've got 70,000 members on there. Of course, you know how many of those are bots and people that,
Right.
join for whatever reason. I certainly don't know that numbers like that are always a perfect representation of how many people are actively, building and shooting these kind of bows, but it gives you a sense.
Hmm.
Also just going to events like, OJAM, which I haven't been to, I'd like to go to. There's MoJam in Missouri, and the one I go to every year is the Tennessee Classic, which is a traditional archery 3D shoot. So most of the people that show up there are there to compete in the shoot. Many of them using fiberglass bows, but uh, Mark Baggett, Pappy, the guy that owns the place, he's always been into self bows. I've known him for years on the Primitive Archer Forum, and he's got a big workshop there where anybody that's attending the event can sit around and build bows. And they even have a special competition where you can build a bow while you're there and shoot it against other people who have built a bow there, and just kind of be competing against those bowyers. And it's a really really fun event, and it's great to see so many people coming together to build bows communally like that. I mean, kind of like, OJAM, does that as well. It's pretty neat because you see people coming in that have never done it before, wanting to build their first bow, and, as well as people that are really, really experienced and knowledgeable, all just kind of mixing it up and making shavings together.
Yeah, that's great. How many people do you think came to the Tennessee Classic?
I think Pappy said that there was like over 800 registered shooters. Like that's their
Okay.
metric for measuring that. They've got big
Yeah.
areas for people to camp, and it's definitely busy. And I don't know how that compares to other gatherings. And like I said, a lot of those people aren't there to build bows, but they're definitely, traditional archers at heart.
Right. Where is OJAM?
I don't know exactly. I think it's in kind of the Ozark area of
Okay.
Oklahoma. Yeah, I'd really like to try to make it out there. It's a bit of a drive for me, but it takes place in the spring. Can't remember exactly when. I want to say April sometime. Tennessee Classic's always the first weekend of May. Um,
And these archery jamborees happen all over the world. Is that right?
I mean, there's definitely, a handful that happen in the States. I'm sure there are others in other countries. I'm trying to think of, if I've seen any examples online or whatever. I'm sure that there are. I don't know how they compare in size and scope. They might be more modest affairs. Maybe there's something big out there that I don't know about.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I find so fascinating with archery is that it has such deep cultural roots, like
Yeah,
10,000 years ago, all over the earth.
yeah,
Really, it's like most traditional cultures had their own variety or their own special way of making bows and arrows and the way they use them. And this has been going on for millennia. It's really incredible. The only
yeah.
culture that I've heard of that maybe didn't have any was Australia,
That's what I've heard
and I'm
too.
sure some of the islands around there. But I think
Yeah,
everywhere else, it's been a part of humanity.
yeah. I mean, it's part of what really pulls me in with it is that common human legacy, and I really feel like there's something deep within us that archery speaks to. It's I feel like everybody that I talk to about what I do either actively loves and pursues archery, or I get a lot of responses of like, oh, I've always wanted to do that, or oh, I remember shooting a bow in Boy Scouts when I was a kid. And you never hear anybody that's just like, oh, I hate archery, that's stupid. Like, uh, I think, for most people out there, there's some, fascination with it, whether it's active or just kind of in their imagination. And I really love the living history of archery, and learning about different cultures where it was created and evolved, and looking at the different bows and arrows that people have created, and it really gives you an appreciation for human ingenuity and adaptiveness, because every bow out there is a response to a particular you know set of circumstances and environment, what they had to work with for material, what the climate was like, what uses they needed for it, whether it was hunting and warfare, and all sorts of factors that go into why they made the bows the way that they did. And it's easy to, I think, judge sometimes, like, oh, that seems really simple, or that seems ineffective, or why would they do that? But I think having that kind of attitude about it really just kind of lacks curiosity and imagination, because no people are stupid or primitive. Every human being has the same capacity for intelligence and ingenuity, and they're all working with what they've got to solve very particular sets of problems and needs. I think it's a really fascinating lens to look at that human ingenuity through archery, because it's so widespread and you can see all the different ways that people have approached it.
Yeah. And I share similar experiences with you. Like, I've never met a person who, when I say that I teach traditional archery, or I amateur bow carver, or I'm writing this book, everyone's fascinated. Like, they
Yeah,
want to know more about it. And I can't think of many like activities or arts or sports where across the board everyone has an interest in it. And
right.
everyone who I've ever taught to shoot, I don't think I've ever had a single person who has walked away going, no, I didn't like that. That wasn't
Yeah,
worth it. Everyone loves it. They resonate with it. They feel empowered by it. They feel like inspired by it. It's really incredible to see that happen across the board.
Yeah, and I think when I think that's the case for archery in general, but for me, and I think for a lot of other people, when you take it to the level where you're making your own bow out of a piece of wood and you develop such an intimate relationship with that piece of wood and that bow as it takes shape, and then that moment where you're shooting that first arrow, out of the bow, is just something really magical about that even now after I've made, hundreds of bows, I still get a feeling of joy, shooting that first arrow out of a bow that I made, even though I've done it enough that I know what to expect on some level, but it's still pretty special. And I when I teach my bow building classes, whenever I can, I try to film that first shot of each person, because a lot of times you get some pretty cool reactions from them, just spontaneous, expressions or emotions that come out when they shoot that first arrow.
Yeah. Do you ever have any tinge of anxiety when you're shooting the bow for the first time? Or are you so skilled with the tillering and everything, you're fully confident that the bow is going to hold up?
I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to project any level of arrogance about that, because anybody that builds self bows will admit that it's a perpetually humbling craft. I mean, we're working with a natural material, and we're asking an incredible amount from that piece of wood. I mean, I can't think of any other application of woodworking that comes anywhere near the amount of dynamic stress that we're putting this wood under, not just once, but, over and over and over again. We're expecting it to perform in this particular way. So, I mean, to answer your question, I don't, I mean, it's, when I'm making a bow, I've accumulated enough knowledge and experience and things to watch out for during the process that when I get to the point of being ready to shoot it, I feel pretty confident that everything's going to go fine. I feel like if there was going to be an issue that was going to come up, it ideally would have come up during the tillering process. And it's not to say that, bows don't break, whether I'm shooting them or somebody else is shooting them. I mean, thankfully it's very rare. Otherwise it wouldn't be a very good, business prospect for me. But when I go to shoot a bow for the first time, I've already, bent it, many times on the tillering tree out to full draw. And I've really analyzed the tiller, and I'm, confident in the design, and, kept my eye out for any defects or anything like that. So usually when I go out to shoot it for the first time, I'm feeling pretty confident about it.
Yeah. Let's go back to the beginning when you said you did that bow carving workshop or part of it. How old were you when that was?
I must have been about 25. I mean, so that was about, it was right before my son was born.
Okay.
So, and he's 15. So yeah, I mean, it's 15, 16 years ago, something like that. Yeah. So
Okay.
early 20s.
And then soon after that, you went to study under John in Oregon.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
So I've been
when
actively building bows for about 15 years now.
when did Swiftwood Bows, your brand, come alive?
Well, I was sometime probably around 2011 or 12 or something like that would be my guess. I'd been building bows on the side. I was a teacher at the time, and so building them on the evenings and the weekends, and I felt like I'd built all the bows that I needed for myself to shoot, and I'd given away bows to anybody that I knew that would want one, and I just really was feeling burning desire to continue to build them and refine the craft. And so the only way that I felt like it really made sense for me to keep making bow after bow as if I was going to start selling them. And, you know, by that time I'd been making them for several years and felt like I'd gotten to the point where I felt confident about putting a bow in somebody else's hand for money. And it was right around the time that my friend Carson was starting Echo Archery. You know, he does Sherwood shafts now, the Doug Fir shafts out of Oregon. And so he and I kind of were bouncing ideas off of each other. I was picking his brain about how he was going about, you know, starting to sell bows and, you know, so at first it was just one here, one there, you know, not a lot, but just enough to create some side income to help, you know, fuel my continued passion for building bows. And it just kind of slowly escalated from there to where I, you know, I was still working full time as a teacher, but you know, I'd have, you know, 10, 15 orders lined up, you know, at a time for bows and just get to them when I could. And then I hit a point with my teaching that I felt like I wanted to step away and focus that energy more on my own kids and my family and you know, just kind of reimagine my occupation and I decided to switch over to bow making full time and step away from teaching. And that was about 6 or 7 years ago now, whenever we moved from Oregon to North Carolina at that time.
That's the dream, right? Being able to pursue your passions full time. It's
Yeah, I
awesome.
mean, I really, I'm really grateful that I'm able to do it. I certainly not a get rich quick scheme, you know, but neither was teaching. So,
Yeah.
kind of resigned myself to that fate. But, yeah, I mean, people warn you, you know, don't take what you love and turn it into your job. And, um, I guess in some situations or for some people that is probably good advice. For me, I've never regretted that, and it hasn't detracted at all from my enjoyment of building bows. In fact, I think that it really helped heighten and refine my passion for it in the sense that when I knew that somebody was going to be paying me good hard-earned money for this bow that I was making, it put me in a different mindset and a different relationship with the project. I mean, I'm always been very detail oriented and, you know, focused on good finish work and good tiller and all that. But having that added pressure or incentive kind of brings me to a new level with it and pushes me to do even better and in a good way, in a way that feels, you know, enjoyable and validating. And it's, I think, allowed me to reach levels with my bow making that I'm not sure that I necessarily would have pushed myself to if I'd have just kept it as a hobby. Um, so I, you know, there's not a day that I wake up that I'm like, oh man, I got to go out to my shop and make bows. Like this sucks. You know, I mean, of course there's days where I have more or less energy and, but I'm always, you know, happy to be doing what I'm doing and looking forward to my next class or my next project. And yeah, I enjoy it.
What was the first bow that you sold?
First bow that I sold. Oh yeah, I remember. So it was this straight limbed Osage longbow. And I remember there was a bow bill, or I'm sorry, an archery range, a public outdoor archery range in Portland, Oregon. It was pretty cool. There's not, you know, it's part of the city park system, and so it's free. And you know, that sort of thing's pretty rare these days, to have access to that. It was a pretty cool place to go because, you know, it's Portland and you'd have your hardcore compound bow hunters, you know, sighting in their bows for the season. And then you'd have all these, you know, weird Portland people, you know, all sorts of interesting characters there. But anyway, I was there shooting in this bow that I'd made. It, you know, hadn't even put any finish on it yet. I just wanted to put it through its paces. And there was a guy there that was interested in my bows and started talking to me. And, you know, asked me if I sold any, and I was like, well, actually, you know, this is planning on selling this bow right here, and you know, you can shoot it if you want. And so he shot it a little bit, and you know, fell in love with it, and we stayed in touch. And he ended up buying it from me, and he actually became a friend of mine and got into bow making as well. And you know, it wasn't until later that I told him that was literally the first bow I'd ever sold, and he thought that was pretty funny because he didn't realize that at the time. Um, but yeah, that
How
was the
were you
first bow.
getting how were you getting your customers back then?
I created a website fairly early on in the process, and you know, I started, you know, a Facebook page for my business. And you know, so from the beginning, I'd say most of my business was coming from, you know, just my social media presence on Facebook, and having a website, and being an active part of, you know, various bow making and traditional archery groups. And I mean, that's kind of been my core strategy throughout, even to this day, you know, just putting more and more emphasis on social media. And it, it's a struggle for me because I don't, it's not easy for me to put myself on the camera all the time and make content. And it's definitely something I know I need to do more of, because I know that it'll help my business grow. But every day I just have this dilemma, you know, I'm like, well, I know I should be making a video or making some content, but I could just grab this bow and work on it instead. And it's a lot easier to talk myself into, you know, grabbing a piece of wood to work on than setting up the cameras and thinking through what I'm going to say and editing all of it. And so it's been a struggle for me. And I see other people who are more successful on that front, you know, doing similar work to what I do, and try to motivate myself, you know, based on their success with that. But it's pretty hit and miss for me. I go through phases where I make a lot of content and then I won't for, you know, months.
Yeah, you're not the only one. That's for sure. I would like to do away with that whole aspect, even recording podcasts. I would rather just have a conversation with you.
Sure.
But I know for this project that my daughter and I are doing, the whole thing is Project Quiver is going to be largely on social media, which is going to be a big stretch for me. I have no social media presence whatsoever.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting. But yeah, it is kind of in some ways necessary today to get
Yeah.
anything out there.
I mean, I don't know how people did this kind of work before social media. I mean, I guess you just had to like travel around and show up at every event,
Yeah.
you know, put up a booth, and you build up word of mouth. But it's hard to imagine, you know, doing this full time without the internet. But I guess people did it. It's probably just fewer of them.
Yeah. So what's your favorite type of wood to work with for bow making?
That's a good question. It's funny, like, you know, my knee-jerk answer is Osage, and it's undisputably an amazing bow wood. You know, it has every quality that you would want, and it's durable and it's attractive looking, and it's just a very undeniably an amazing bow wood. And it's what I make. You know, I'd say the vast majority of the bows that I sell are made out of Osage. That being said, you know, when I look at my personal collection and the bows that I shoot, almost all of them are Pacific U. And I'm not, it's hard to put my finger on exactly why that is. You know, I think part of it is having started my bow making adventure in Oregon and having access to, you know, U that I was able to cut myself or, you know, trade from friends. And it's a beautiful wood, and it has a magic to it that is kind of hard to describe. It's also definitely more finicky than Osage. It you know, the out of all the failures that I've had over the years, most of them I'd say were U bows. And when it goes, it's exciting. It blows up in the splinters. And so, you know, I have, you know, I have mixed feelings about it. And I've got some really nice U staves now that I've been able to work with, and I've been making some really nice bows out of it, and definitely learned. I think, you know, most of my failures with you that I had in the past were really just pushing the limits of what was a quality stave to work with. I mean, I think that for the most part, you really um, does best when it's a very clean, pristine piece of wood. And you can make character bows with it, but it's definitely flirting with some um, excitement. But
Y-
you know, really, you know, Osage is hard to beat, and it's definitely when I'm making a bow for someone, it's my default to reach for. I also work some with Eastern hop hornbeam, which is also known as ironwood. It's my favorite white wood to work with. And after that, hickory is pretty good. You know, the issue I run into here in North Carolina, and you'll probably laugh being in Costa Rica, but you know, the humidity here makes it harder to get real quality bows out of white woods that are lacking a bit of compression strength compared to woods like Osage or yew. They tend to take set and be a little bit more sluggish in humid climates, and you can counteract that with heat tempering the belly, which is what I do when I work with white woods here. But it's just another step to the process, and so yeah,
I would
go ahead.
I would love to learn more about that because yeah, in Costa Rica I've lost so many bows. They worked fine in the Pacific Northwest, even though it's really humid there as well. But I think it's the combination of the extreme heat and humidity. And I had one U bow buckle like it was a PVC pipe,
Yeah.
and it didn't
Hmm.
break. It still looks fine when it's unstrung, but you can see where that crease is in it. But it just fully buckled while I was shooting it.
Wow.
And
I've never seen that happen with you.
my first year, well, I made it too. So let's just say it didn't have a perfect tiller. I'm sure of that. It was an early bow. But I went through many bows when I first moved here, and it was really disappointing.
Yeah.
I had to point of tears often, and teaching archery when equipment starts failing, it gets a little nerve wracking.
Yeah, I'm
Uh,
sure.
I'm fascinated with all the different types of woods, and you know, part of this podcast is educational for bow making. So I'd like to take a few minutes to actually talk about like some of your favorite woods. So when I give lessons and people see my quiver of bows, they're always curious about what kind of woods. I have some laminates, I have some self bows. My first bow ever that I bought off of Jamie McDonald, or Ravenbeak bows, was a yew wood longbow. The first 2 or 3 bows I ever made were with Jamie McDonald. They were all yew wood longbows. And when I tell people it's yew wood, most of them have never even heard of it.
Right.
And I I hadn't heard of Osage orange until years after that when I started to get into
Mhm.
bow making. It was my understanding, though, I guess we'll start with yew wood. It is in the Pacific Northwest of the States and Canada.
Mhm.
It grows throughout England. I'm pretty sure it grows through many countries in Europe.
Yeah.
And and then yew wood, I have a farm in British Columbia, and the yew wood trees I have on there are really gnarly. Like
Mhm.
it's hard to imagine getting a section that's even 2 feet long and straight versus
Right.
6 or 7 feet long. And it's my understanding that in England, it's now protected, or at least they had to protect it at some point because the tree was going extinct because
Mhm.
most of them were being cut down for bow making.
Yeah. My so there are two distinct species. The European yew is called Taxus baccata, and the um, North American yew is Taxus brevifolia. And there, you know, there's some differences, but they're both good quality, you know, bow wood. Um, and I think that, you know, some people like to quibble about one being better than the other. I really don't think that they're. I think it has a lot more to do with the individual tree and the individual stave than it does between the difference between the species. So I think from a bow making standpoint, I think it's pretty reasonable to just kind of talk about them as one type of bow wood. But yeah, I mean in Europe, it's pretty widespread, and the most sought after yew wood in Europe came from the high elevation in the Alps in like France and Spain and Italy. You know, the the more resource starved the tree was, the thinner the growth rings that it laid down, and so the resulting, you know, wood was much denser and, you know, just had better bow qualities, you know, better compression strength, less likely to take set. And so, you know, back in, you know, medieval times when they were mass producing these bows, you know, for the English army, they quickly, you know, depleted good bow wood in England. And my understanding was that during the height of their time, as with the bow being so prominent, that there was even an import tax. Any ship that was coming to England to trade goods was required to have, you know, X amount of yew staves per ton of cargo, or some, you know, there was some ratio that they had, you know, and these staves were all coming from the mainland continent, you know, ideally from, you know, the mountainous regions. And so they had this massive influx of staves coming in with all the trade goods so that they could keep their armies, you know, armed with good yew bows. And yeah, today I think, you know, the British bowyers that I talk to, if they're getting yew from England, it's mostly coming from private, like churchyards and stuff like that. Like it's not uncommon for yew trees to be planted in, you know, graveyards or churchyards. And so there's these really old, massive yew trees. You know, of course they're not cutting down the whole tree. They're just getting permission to cut a branch here or there. But otherwise, I think most British bowyers today are primarily relying on wood from, you know, mainland Europe or from North America getting shipped over. But it's definitely a precious commodity over there. I mean, it is everywhere. You know, in the Pacific Northwest, it mostly grows in the, you know, Cascade and Coast Range, you know, like you said, up into British Columbia, down as far into California. There's a patch in Montana and Idaho and the mountains as well. And, you know, like you said, you know, when you go out to cut, you can walk past a lot of trees before you find anything worth cutting. And that's if you find any trees at all. You know, I talked to guys that cut Osage, you know, and they, you know, are complaining about how hard it is, you know, how hard the work is. And they're not wrong. I mean, cutting bow wood and splitting it and seasoning it, it's all hard work. But I don't think that they always fully appreciated what we had to go through in the Pacific Northwest to get yew wood. Because, you know, usually we'd have to drive at least 3 hours to get out to where we wanted to cut. You'd have to go out to the ranger station, try to get permission, and it was all about who you talk to. Like, you've talked to the right person, they'd be like, oh yeah, you know, I want to cut some yew staves, that's great, you know, here's circle on the map, you know, go over here, there's some good, you can cut as many as you want, you know, just $1 a stave, you know. And then you'd go back another time and you talk to someone and they were acting like they were going to call the cops just because you asked, you know, like, it's like, okay, what is it, can we cut it or not? And you know, there's definitely a lot of yew out there. I mean, it's not as common as like Doug fir or hemlock or things like that. It's not whole forests of it, but there's definitely big patches out there. And I've never really felt concerned about, you know, us handful of bowyers going out there and cut, you know, because like I said, we're going to walk past, you know, 50 trees before we find one that we want to cut. And
as you said, that's a branch.
Well, I mean, even cutting a tree, you know, but loggers, they're going to clear cut the whole area. They're going to throw all that yew onto a pile and burn it, you know. Well, and also a big impact on the population out there was the Taxol. That, I mean, yew is toxic, and they found that they could make a chemotherapy drug out of the bark. And so there was a period there where people were going out and any yew tree that they could find, they were stripping the bark off of it and selling it for Taxol, and that definitely hurt the population because they were able to be pretty indiscriminate, and they weren't even cutting the trees down a lot of times. And you can still
Well,
find, yew trees out there that have been stripped of bark, but they synthesize the drug, and so they don't need the yew bark anymore to make it, but it still had an impact on the population out there. So it's getting
yeah.
harder to legally harvest yew on public lands. I think they're tightening down on it from what I've heard. So if you don't have access to it on private land, it can be a little trickier. I don't know what things are like in British Columbia, but
Well, it's a sad story because, as you mentioned, the logging industry, they clear cut entire mountains, and the yew wood is considered just a byproduct of that and a waste product. So, what I have been told by some of my teachers that work with yew is that those yew trees that are destroyed in the clear cuts just become road base. They literally
right.
just put them down and build the roads on top of them. And at the time I started bow carving anyway, Jamie McDonald had said you can't get permits as an artisan to harvest wood in British Columbia. You can only get permits if you're one of these giant corporations that's taking
Right.
down an entire mountainside. And so you had to have contacts within the forestry industry to let you know when a tree had been taken down and before it got destroyed in a road base or in a fire, you might be lucky enough to go out and salvage it.
Yeah,
But
my
yeah, it's
experience with loggers in Oregon was, these companies, they didn't want to deal with the liability of anybody that wasn't one of their loggers going out onto their property and cutting stuff. And so they just would blanket refuse anybody to cut anything, just, I think for liability purposes, if nothing else,
yeah.
which was frustrating. But
Well, in British Columbia, it's not typically private property that gets logged. It's normally what's called crown land, which is owned by the government. And these forestry companies get permits to go into crown land and do this. So it's not even, I don't even think
yeah,
it's a liability issue in that case.
sure. I mean, so one, talking about Pacific Northwest woods, have you heard of vine maple?
Yes.
The
I've
vine
not worked
maple
with it.
is a really good bow wood. And I was turned on to it by John Strunk. I mean, he's definitely the one that I think popularized the idea of vine maple being used for a bow. I don't know if anybody was really talking about it much before him, aside from, the natives in the area. But it's, the nice thing about vine maple is, it's like a weed. It's all over the place, finding
I have
vine
a lot
maple.
on my farm. Yeah.
And, finding a straight enough piece can be challenging. It grows in clumps and kind of goes out at an angle. And, but that angular growth is actually one of its features of what makes it a good bow wood, so you've got this trunk that's, growing out at an angle for the entire life of the tree. And so along that top portion of that trunk, the entire life of that tree, it's under tension. And so when
Right.
we harvest vine maple, we mark the top part of the section, or we mark the top part of the trunk, the part that's facing up. So when we cut it, we're able to remember, and that's going to be the back of the bow. That's the tension side. And a
Okay.
lot of times when you start taking wood off the other side to reduce it down to bow proportions, that, you know, that tension gets released, and the whole stave will just pull into sometimes pretty unmanageable amount of reflex, to the point where you have to like heat some of the reflex out of the bow because it's more than you would want. But it makes for a really snappy bow, because it's really
Hmm.
still wanting to pull against the string in that way. And it if you treat it right and build it right, it makes a really, really incredible bow. But
So the
it
top,
go ahead.
sorry, the top part is that becomes the back of the bow. And
Right.
is it growing in a bit of a deflex then?
Not
Like, is it kind of,
necessarily. Um,
no? Okay.
sometimes it does. Sometimes it's relatively straight. Sometimes it's, already reflex. It's tricky to find pieces that are not real gnarly and, have kind of jogs, and, almost every vine maple bow has some character to it. And, it's tough, stringy wood. Like it doesn't work well with draw knives or scrapers, or it clogs up rasps. Like the best tool we found for working at was those microplane rasps. They're kind of like a
Okay.
Sureform, but like they don't clog up as badly as a farrier's rasp or something like that would.
Really?
But
Okay.
it definitely, vine maple makes you work for your bow. But when if you do it right, it makes a pretty great bow. And so I think it's a good alternative for bowyers in that area that for whatever reason are not able to access you wood, just to know that there's another very common wood species that most people wouldn't care if you cut, that you can make all the
Right.
bows you want out of with it.
And is that with a D section or is that more of a flat bow?
It's like other white woods in that it does best when it's a flat bow with a wide flat belly, because it'll have similar compression issues with a narrow rounded belly that any other white wood
Okay.
would struggle with. And
And then
it's
how thick
typically
do
a
you
pretty
want it to
small
be?
diameter. It's a pretty small diameter tree most of the time, and so a lot of times you're going to have that high crown.
Okay.
So you deal with the crown, and you make the belly as wide and flat as you can. It lends itself to that kind of flat bow design.
I'm going to seek some staves out this season and get them through the end of the drying process, because they do grow like weeds. There are
Yeah.
clumps of them everywhere.
And the nice thing about them too is they don't take as long to season as you would need with
Okay.
like a yew stave or something like that. If you know you cut it, if it lets you peel the bark off, if the sap is running and you could peel the bark off, go ahead and do that. You might want to wipe a little something on the back, like some shellac or something, but typically it doesn't check very readily. And you can even reduce, get some of the wood off the belly, kind of reduce it down to roughed out proportions right away. Some people like to strap it down so it doesn't get squirrely as it's drying out, because that tension can want to pull it in different directions. But if you get the bark off it and you rough it out some, especially during the summer months where it's hot, dry, in the Pacific Northwest, you could work with it, make a bow out of it, in a few months.
Oh, wow.
John
And
Strunk has even, done it over a campfire, cut a sapling and, kind of dried it out over the campfire while he was working on it and made a perfectly serviceable bow, in a day or two.
wow. Did you say Douglas fir earlier as a bow wood?
No, I was just saying,
You said your
that
friend was using Douglas
Oh,
fir.
he uses it for arrow shafts. Sorry. So Sherwood
Arrow
Shafts
shaft.
is a wood shaft company that's been around
Okay.
for, his dad was one of the owners of it, and he ended up taking it over from um the old timers that were running it with his dad. And so they're my favorite wood shafts to use by far. A lot
For
tougher than
arrows.
your
Yeah.
Porterfoot cedar shafts. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was I misheard you there because I was thinking if
Oh yeah.
Douglas
No.
fir can be used, I've got a lot. That's
I
great.
know. I always looked at all like we had a lot of big leaf maples where I lived in
Yeah.
Oregon, and they were just all these straight, perfect trees all around. And I would just always think to myself, like, man, I really wish you could make a good bow out of big leaf maple, but it's just too
You
soft.
can.
And you could, I mean,
Uh,
I mean, you could make a bow out of it. It's not a great option. It's just, it's not hard like, sugar maple or something like that. Um, it's
right.
it's a much softer, lighter wood.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap up the wood lesson with
Sure.
Osage, because it's a wood that I know very little about. I've only worked with it now in laminates. I haven't actually made a self bow out of it because I don't have access to it in the Pacific Northwest, and in Costa
Right.
Rica, I definitely don't have access to it.
Yeah, I mean, Osage is something pretty remarkable. The historic range of it, was actually quite small area, like in northern Texas, parts of Oklahoma and Kansas, Missouri. Like there's this kind of small area where the Osage Native Americans lived, and they used it for bows and they traded it prolifically, for hundreds of miles in all directions. Like other tribes would trade for it to use as a bow wood. And it's different from whitewoods or from yew, where you're typically just removing the bark and using the sapwood under the bark as the back of the bow. With Osage, you're typically getting down past the sapwood and you're chasing a single growth ring of the heartwood, and so the entire bow is comprised of the heartwood. You can use sapwood on the back like you might with or like you might with yew, but typically people get rid of the sapwood. It's much more likely to check in the drying process. And so anyway, it's a very dense kind of resinous wood, and it has a really nice kind of depth and luster to it just in terms of looks. And it starts off typically as a real kind of electric yellow color when it's fresh cut, but as with exposure to UV over time, it will darken to kind of a honey gold, and then you know uh, uh, more and more brown until it's almost like chocolatey brown after years of seasoning. And it it's got good tension strength when you've got that single ring chased on the back, and it's got great compression strength on the belly, so it does well in humid climates. And it it really lends itself to a real wide variety of designs, anything from a, D cross section English longbow to a, real short, Native American style, horse bow, or anything in between. There's really not many designs that it doesn't do well for. And, it's got a pretty cool, natural history too. Apparently, it's got these fruit balls that are like this big green kind of brainy looking fruits that are not edible for people.
Is that the
But
hedge apple?
yeah, the hedge apple. I mean, and that's
Okay.
the thing, people know the tree by different terms. Some people call it hedge, some people call it hedge apple, some people call it bodark. And so sometimes you'll be talking to somebody who lives where it is, and they've never heard the word Osage before. They just call it hedge or whatever. It virtually does not rot. So they make fence posts out of it. Farmers love it for fence posts because those fence posts will just be there forever. I mean, I know people that have dug up a 150-year-old fence post out of the ground, gotten down past the weathered wood, and made a bow from what was inside. It's
That's
really
amazing.
incredible stuff. And it got spread throughout all, the Midwest and up into the Northeast, and by farmers. They also plant like live hedgerows along the edge of their fields as wind breaks, and so it's spread quite widely from its original range. And what I was going to say about the natural history of it is pretty cool. Like apparently the original seed dispersal was done by like megafauna, like giant ground sloths and stuff like that. They were the ones that ate the fruit and dispersed the seeds. And so it's kind of this like holdover, from a bygone era, and it doesn't really have an ecological niche anymore like it used to, because all the animals that it had evolved to interact with for seed dispersal are gone. Um, but
So there
now,
were giant ground sloths in the U.S. area?
yeah,
Really? Did not know that.
yeah.
Is this like dinosaur time or more recent?
Well, no, after dinosaurs. So this is like the. I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I might be slightly wrong, but kind of like the Pleistocene era, where there was like woolly mammoths and giant ground sloths and, all the big megafauna, when the original migrants to the North America, came over the land bridge or, and
Yeah.
were hunting these animals, it was kind of during that era.
Okay. And do you have any Osage growing near you in North Carolina, or is it still in that region you mentioned?
North Carolina's marginal. Like, I don't know of any that's like naturalized there. There's hedgerows planted by farmers. I've harvested some. Hedgerow Osage is not usually all that great for bows because they have so much sun exposure that they just kind of grow all over the place and tend to be pretty gnarly trees, and finding straight sections can be harder. The best Osage, is grown down in, dark creek bottoms where it's really reaching for the light and growing straight and clean, trying to get up to the light. And we just don't have stands of it like that in North Carolina, but there are some in Virginia, there's some in Tennessee, that I've been trying to connect with somebody that's got access to some that I can, do a day's drive with a truck and a trailer and load up. But I haven't quite pulled that off yet. But it's not too far afield for me. But I actually had a friend when I was at the Tennessee Classic a few weeks ago. A friend of mine gifted me an Osage sapling. So I'm gonna plant one. We just bought a house. So we're moving in this weekend, and I'm gonna try to find a good place in the yard to plant that tree, and maybe
That's fitting
maybe a
for a
little.
bowyer, right?
Yeah, I thought so. It was a pretty cool gift.
Yeah. Well, let's thank you for that. Thanks for the history of some of the woods. I'm sure we could talk long about those, but
Yeah.
I want to
Well,
get back to you.
you'll be intimately familiar with Osage after
Good.
making a bow.
That's awesome. I'm really excited for that. How long have you been teaching bow carving?
Let's see. I I mean, I taught informally here and there with individuals. Um, some in Oregon, typically nothing that was paid, it was just a friend or, so I got some practice out there teaching classes, and my friend Carson he was teaching formal classes before I was, and so I went out and hung out with one of his classes one time and kind of saw how he was going about it, and and it wasn't until I got to North Carolina and started doing this full time that I started putting together formal classes. I can't remember what year my first class was, um, but I've been doing it for about 6 years now. I try to do about 5 classes a year, ideally. And lately I've been limiting it to 4 people at a time. So I can really give people, dedicated attention. I feel like I used to do 6 people, and I always pulled it off. But when I started charging more for my classes, I felt like it was only fair to limit the amount of people in it. So people really felt like they were getting their money's worth out of it. And, um, it's always been really important for me, for everybody to walk away feeling successful, having a beautiful bow, and that takes a lot of hard work and a lot of focus from me to make sure that, people are able to stay on track and finish their bow, by the end of the 4 days. And I know people teach classes on shorter timelines than that, but to me that seems super stressful and risky, because if any little hitch comes along or you got to backtrack or, start over with something, like having less than 4 days seems like it would risk the possibility of people not being successful.
And when you teach, are you using only Osage orange?
Yeah, typically that's my go-to
Okay.
bow wood, just it's because it has such good compression strength. It's forgiving of, errors. If you have some tillering issues as you're going along, you're much less likely to develop, a hinge or set or, compression fractures or something like that. And, a lot of people would say like a good beginner wood would be hickory. And in some ways that's true. I mean, it's quite forgiving as well because it just has such great tension. We have to deal with the compression issue of hickory in this climate, and I don't want to deal with heat tempering everybody's bows. And if we don't do that, if we don't do
Right.
that, then I run the risk of people having bows, taking a bunch of set or even picked up compression fractures. Excuse me. So I really feel like Osage is the ideal wood for my classes.
How tedious?
Hmm?
Sorry, how tedious is it to chase that growth ring on the back?
Yeah, I was just about to say, I mean, that's what people consider to be the biggest obstacle for Osage and beginners is chasing that ring. And it really depends on the piece of wood. And so typically when I'm looking at Osage and choosing whether it's a good stave or not, one thing I look at is the rings. And, if they're nice and fat, that's really helpful because it's a lot easier to chase a thick ring. If you got real thin rings, it's real easy to accidentally cut through it with your draw knife and have to start over again. But you're also looking at the ratio between the early wood and the late wood. Every growth ring is made up of a lighter, more crumbly layer of early wood and a thicker, denser, darker layer of late wood. And so I look at the ratio between the two. I want to see real kind of pencil thin early wood lines and thicker late wood lines. And if you've got all that in place and you don't have knots to deal with and you don't have, sometimes there'll be a little dips and valleys on the back, those sorts of things will really slow you down. But, I can, if I don't have any real obstacles, I can chase a ring on a bow in 4 or 5 minutes.
Really? Wow.
But if I've got valleys to deal with or, significant knots to work around, or if the rings are real thin, it could definitely get slowed down and need to take longer. Typically in the class, I have a lot of experience and confidence, so I'm able to go faster. It's understandable I remember chasing my first ring. It took me forever. So I encourage people to pace, slow down as much as they need to be careful. And so sometimes people will spend, 4 or 5 hours chasing that ring. Ideally, I'd like them to get it done sooner, just in terms of pacing the class. But like I said, with a 4-day class, we can have a little bit of wiggle room. If somebody gets bogged down in one particular aspect of the bow making, we can usually catch up, in other areas. But it just really depends on the stave more than anything. Even if you're inexperienced, if you have a stave that's really set up for success, you can chase it in fairly short order once you get the feel for it. A lot of it is about feel for me. I mean, I wonder, I should try sometime to see if I could chase the ring with my eyes closed. I'm sure it wouldn't go well, but I feel like a lot of it has to do with the feel for me. Like I can feel when the draw knife is, um, you know, skating along that denser late wood and biting into that, crumbly early wood. And, you really have to do it to understand what I'm saying. But you'll see what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I look forward to that. So what I'm learning as I go along and meet different bowyers is not all bowyers are avid practitioners of archery.
Mhm.
I think probably most of them got into carving bows from doing archery, but I've met quite a few who do archery to test their bows, but outside of that, there's not much. What about you?
Yeah, that's a good question. We were talking a lot about that when I was at the Tennessee Classic. I definitely think that I'd say it's a pretty fair rule that anybody that is a really accomplished bowyer is typically not also a really accomplished archer. Um, just largely, I think, because of, people that are really good archers spend a lot of time shooting and refining that. And, when your focus is making the bows, like you said, most of the shooting that you end up doing as a bowyer is just putting each bow through its paces. And when I'm doing that, it's hard for me to focus on all the important details of, good archery. I'm really paying attention to how the bow feels and like how the arrow flight looks and stuff like that. And it's easy for me to forget about all the things that I should be thinking about when I'm shooting. Plus, every bow's got a different draw length and a different draw weight, and often I'm not able to tune up. And usually I'm not able to tune up arrows with a particular bow that I'm just shooting in. So, you know, it's not great practice for my archery. And so I definitely am not a world-class shooter by any stretch. Like going to the Tennessee Classic, which is a competitive 3D shoot, and there's a lot of people that come there to seriously, compete. And some of the people that
Right.
I camp with and shoot with, are world-class archers. Some of them have competed for the US team abroad, and they consistently win, the categories that they compete in. And so going out with them, it's even more humbling because they're um, really, really shown me how it's done. And, there's a couple exceptions, I think, to that split between archers and bowyers. Robert Garcia, one of the guys that I camp with, he's a prolific bowyer, does it full time for a lot of the year, and makes great bows, but he's also an incredible shot and, competes regularly. And another one is Tony Tall. I don't know if you've heard his name.
No.
He's a friend of mine who he's not a professional bowyer. He sells bows here and there, often builds them for raffles and fundraisers and stuff like that. But he's a very good bowyer, but he's also just a incredible shot with self bow especially. And, he almost always wins or comes close to winning, these tournaments. But aside from a few exceptions like that, people tend to either be one or the other, but not both.
Right. Yeah, I just interviewed, well, it's been a couple weeks now, but just about to release an interview with Corey Hawk of
Yeah.
Organic Archery. And he seems to be an avid archer. He does it daily. And we talk in that podcast about how it's therapeutic for him. And that if he doesn't do it daily, he can really see the negative impact on his overall health. So it's something that he takes very seriously, and he also hunts with it. And he's very dedicated as an archer and as a bowyer. But a lot of bowyers I've met have shared similar things that you shared. And my first teacher, Jamie McDonald, when I was there at his workshop carving my first bow in British Columbia, he mentioned that he rarely ever shoots. I was like, what? How's that even possible? But I can understand it. And it is something where the art of bow crafting is such a specialty, and it's consuming, like in a great meditative sort of way. But I've been able to pass 12 plus hours a day just in my barn carving bows and not coming up for air. So
yeah, I mean, I really intend to improve my shooting. It's something that I would like to do, and I've been putting more work into it. In this last year at the Classic, I pulled my friend Robert aside and was like, okay, I'm really plateauing here. Like I need some help, So we went out and he coached me through, and gave me some really good solid pointers. And, I'm kind of trying to veer out of the instinctive route a little bit and play around with, some point of aim, style shooting, because it's, I was pretty stubbornly instinctive for a long time, but at a certain point I just had to admit, like, I'm not getting any better, like I need something to work with, to focus on. And I've been struggling with target panic for years now, just really bad.
What's that?
I mean, it's a psychological thing, and there's a lot of debate about whether it's even real or not, or, it means different things to different people. But for me, what it means is, my intention is to have a nice smooth draw, good back tension, good, tension in my bow arm, get to my anchor point, settle for a second, make sure everything looks and feels right, and then release. I'm not want to hold it there forever, just a solid second's good enough. But what I do is every time I get, even if I just barely get to anchor, sometimes not even, and then I release. And it's so frustrating, is every time I'll just tell myself, like, Weylin, get to full draw, settle for a second. Like, you know, I'll be talking to myself, you know, and it doesn't matter what I say to myself, especially if I'm in a social situation, like on a 3D course or something like that, it's even worse. And I really struggle to settle into my anchor, and I'm just snap shooting when I don't mean to. And it's really frustrating. But some of the things that I was working on with my friend, you know, help a lot. And if I can really sit down and implement them, I think it'll probably take care of the problem largely, you know, because, you know, what he talks about is like really knowing what your whole shot sequences, like from the very, very beginning, the very first thing you do, that's a ritual part of you getting ready to shoot. And like you said, like literally sit down and write down every step of your process, and then just get out there and like go through your process step by step until you're ready to shoot, but then don't shoot and let down, and then go
Right.
through it again, and like get really used to just going through that process without the stress or pressure of actually shooting. And, you know, and he said, like, if you're ever about to shoot and you feel yourself skip a step or something feels weird or wrong, like give yourself permission to stop, let down, take a deep breath and start over. And I can't believe how hard that is.
Yeah.
Like my brain will not let me do that. I don't know that I've ever successfully done that.
Really?
When I intend to shoot, I just push through all the, you
Mm.
know, mistakes, and I shoot anyway, and with, you know, predictably bad results. But I just it's amazing how difficult it is to tell myself to actually just abort and start over.
This,
Um,
this is fascinating for me because mostly I teach people who've never done archery. And
uh-huh.
so, as you were describing what your friend told you, I walk them through every step of the mechanics, of the physics behind it. And I think most importantly is I get them, it's a deeply somatic exercise for them. I get them to actually drop into their bodies and really feel every part of their body and what it's doing and engaging everything. And so for me, my shot is always very meditative and it's always deeply connected to my breath. And so if my breath is not right, then nothing else is going to be right. So I teach that first
Right.
and foremost to my students. Every shot, connect it with your breath. And I'll see them, they'll be going through the motions and either they'll have a bad shot or I'll say it while they're mid shot and I'll just ask, are you breathing? And then you'll see everything changes. They start breathing again. So
Right.
it's everything from the draw arm coming up higher than the clavicle so that the clavicle can fully rise up, so the chest can fully expand. And the whole process, it's fascinating for me. And I think because I've been teaching it, that's where I've really kind of put my focus is in the intention behind the archery. And
Sure.
I actually just was shooting with Chuck Leffler a couple days ago. He's with Heartwood Bows in Salt Lake
Yeah, I know
City.
some.
Yeah, and he's here in Costa Rica right now. We went surfing together just a couple
Oh, really?
hours ago. But a couple days ago, we did archery, and he has very different form than anything I would ever teach. And
He
he's
actually owns one of my bows, or owned one of them years ago. There was a bow trade on the Primitive Archer Forum, and I drew his name to make a bow for. I mean, he may not
really
have it anymore. It was a long time ago, but I made him a used self bow. Yeah.
nice. Small world.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of people who I shoot with, some of them who are more consistent archers than me, have form that I would never teach.
Right.
But everyone kind of finds a
Well,
way
as
to
long as
do
you're
it.
consistent, you know, like consistency means a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What is your favorite or your go-to draw weight, or do you have one?
Well, so when I lived in Oregon, I was out hunting elk, and I felt like I needed to have as close to 60 pounds as I could manage. So I was going out with a, you know, 60-pound self bow. I can't say I ever felt great shooting that weight. I felt like I struggled with it a little bit more than I should. You know, certainly if I would
Okay.
have practiced more, I probably would have felt more confident with it. But that always felt like it was a bit much for me. You know, now that I'm here in North Carolina and I'm focused on whitetails, I've been going for more like my current hunting bow is like 52 pounds at my draw length of 27. And that feels a lot more comfortable and under control. I could even see myself maybe going a little bit lighter. I
What's the
definitely
minimum for hunting where you are?
think it's 40. Yeah, I bet it's 40.
I think
I'd
that's
have
what it
to
is in
check.
British Columbia too.
But
Yeah.
I don't think I would go that low. I mean, certainly you can kill a deer with that or even lower. It's really just about, being super confident about your shot placement, having good arrow flight, having a sharp broadhead, and just knowing what your limitations are. I mean, but all that said, I like having a little bit of extra assurance with some extra draw weight, being more at that 50-pound, just in case, you hit that rib or shoulder or whatever, you can have a little bit of more oomph behind your arrow to punch through. But I do think that what's much more important than draw weight is shot placement, arrow flight, and having a sharp broadhead. Like those are all much bigger factors in my opinion than having an extra 5 or 10 pounds of draw weight. Because if you're not hitting the deer where you need to hit them at the angle you need to hit them, it really doesn't matter how much power is behind that arrow. In a lot of cases, anyway.
Yeah. And do you hunt regularly? Is that
I mean,
part of your practice?
yeah, I mean, I not nearly as prolifically as I would like. I've the last, I mean, my whole bow hunting career, I've always had to make compromises. When I was a teacher, bow season was always like the month of September, and that was literally right when school was starting. And so I always felt like my attention was divided and I had to be a weekend warrior. I couldn't go out to Eastern Oregon on some big long hunt. I always had to hunt, on the weekend in the Coast Range where I could just drive out to for a couple days and get back in time for work. And, you know, I, and now, I just haven't like settled on a location that I've really learned well and that is reliable. I keep hunting in a different place every year. And so not getting enough time to scout. And so I'm really just going out there and hoping something walks past me. And my hunting has been more marginal than I would ideally like. And I'm hoping that my life will settle down in ways that will allow me to focus a little bit more on it so I can experience, more success than I have. And doing it with self bows limiting me that much more, in terms of shot opportunities. And I taught a bow building class in Alaska last July. And I had the opportunity to go on a caribou hunt up in the tundra. Um, it was a bow hunt, and it was pretty fun. We saw lots of animals. My buddy got a couple. So I got some sympathy meat to bring home with me, but it was a tough stealth bow hunt. Like I was the only person out there that had a bow that wasn't a compound. Everybody else had compounds, and because there's no cover out there, so it wasn't an unreasonable proposition to get within 40, 50, 60 yards of these animals because they're not super skittish, and sometimes they're even curious. But to get in that 15, 20 yards that I wanted was different, because they would get a whole lot more nervous at that kind of range, and not having much cover to ambush them from, there was definitely a lot of foiled attempts, to get a shot at an animal.
Yeah. Well, Weylin, thanks so much for joining me for this. It's been great to get to know you a bit better before I come and see you in a couple weeks. Can you let everyone know where they can find out more about you and what you offer?
Yeah. I mean, I'm on most social media platforms, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and all of those I'm under Swiftwood Bows. And if you want to reach out to me, email or Facebook Messenger works. I've got a website, swiftwoodbows.com, and I post, my bow building workshops on my website, and that's where you can reach out to me if you're interested in buying a bow or yeah.
All right, cool.
Swiftwood
So
Bows.
one parting question. You're named after a tree. Olive is your last name. A lot of fruit-bearing trees are good bow woods. Can you carve
That's
a
what I
bow
think.
out of olive wood?
That's a good question. I don't know. So people talk about Russian olive, but I don't think that's a true olive tree. I think it's a different species. My guess would be it would probably be tricky to find an olive tree that had straight enough section to make a bow out of. You see a lot of those orchard trees, and they're always twisted and gnarly. But yeah, it's a good question. Maybe someday I'll get my hands on a piece.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all of your knowledge, and I look forward to catching up with you soon.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll try to get my shop set up and cleaned up, ready for you. I'm about to move
Right,
it.
to be brand new, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Only a little bit of pressure there to get it all set up for some photographs.
Yeah. I'll do my
Do you have
best.
do you have a good spot in the new house?
Yeah, it's like an attached 2-car garage that's pretty spacious. We'll see once I get all my stuff in there how spacious it feels, but I've
Yeah.
got a vision in my head. I think it'll be a good place to work on bows.
Nice. Well, I look forward to it. Thanks again.
All right, good to talk with you, Todd.
Thanks for listening to Project Quiver on Salish Wolf. Follow our journey on Instagram at Project Quiver as we seek out the world's most extraordinary traditional bowyers, and join our newsletter at projectquiver.com. Our coffee table book, Quiver, The Art of Life Through Bowcraft, arrives in 2026. We are honored to share with you the beauty, history, and magic of traditional archery.